In the outermost sectors of the known galaxy, where even light hesitated to tread, a single species had dominated every test of survival. The Velkrax. Not merely survivors, but conquerors of a planet so brutal, it had no native word for peace. Their homeworld, Velkrax, orbited a dying star. Gravity there was crushing. The winds carried neurotoxic particles, and the native flora consumed bone marrow. Life didn't flourish there. It clawed upward through death. Those who emerged from that crucible were honed to perfection, their biology optimized for war, pain, and endurance. The Velkrax were not large, but dense. Their muscle fibers were interlaced with iron-rich compounds. Their bones were hexagonal microlattices, able to flex under pressure that would liquefy others. They didn't sleep as most species understood it. They entered low-function combat rest states, always semi-aware. Their blood carried quadruple oxygen density, and their minds, those were the true weapons, cold, analytical, evolved without the concept of mercy. Even their language lacked words for surrender, retreat, or fear. For over 4 centuries, they were the galaxy's ultimate enforcers. If a rebellion rose on a fringe colony, Velkrax war fleets arrived with the precision of mathematics. If a rogue species defied council law, Velkrax shock units landed, eradicated resistance, and rebuilt the world in their image. They were the Council's unspeaking sword, and their silence was often the last sound heard before extinction. Other Deathworlders existed, but none challenged them. The Silax had exosuits powered by volcanic vents. The Marhull could survive in the vacuum of space for minutes at a time. Yet even these legendary breeds avoided direct confrontation, because the Velkrax were the apex. Their dominance wasn't just power, it was certainty. Then the whispers began. Intercepted transmissions. A scrambled report from a secondary scout vessel. Claims of an unknown species on a Class F Deathworld. A designation so chaotic even the Velkrax avoided it. The scout's final message before silence was a 3-word burst. They adapt instantly. The Council dismissed it. Rogue Velkrax. Probably victims of equipment failure. But the Velkrax High Corps took no chances. They mobilized a covert observation unit, embedded across neighboring systems, to monitor this emerging anomaly. That anomaly was humanity. Initial findings were conflicting. Humanity had spread to 37 systems, most of them marginal. Their expansion wasn't clean or methodical. It was chaotic, unmapped. Their ships lacked standardized models. Their military protocols varied not just by region, but by captain. Some units used plasma, others kinetic. A few had developed hybrid systems no known species had ever seen. But it wasn't the technology that concerned the Velkrax. It was a behavioral profile. Humans, according to psychological analysis, were incompatible with threat assessment models. They displayed high variability, low pattern predictability, and displayed behaviors labeled as contradictory to survival. During simulations, human subjects under pressure laughed, made irrational decisions that succeeded, and repeatedly exposed themselves to risk with no obvious benefit. Worse, they collaborated spontaneously, often with no shared command structure. They didn't fracture under stress. They thrived in it. One report documented a human officer under heavy artillery fire, who, instead of retreating, charged with a makeshift weapon and turned the tide of battle. The weapon? A pipe fused with a thermal battery, wrapped in ceramic and desperation. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Human soldiers were observed reprogramming alien drones using interface ports they shouldn't have been able to decipher. Civilians on resource-poor colonies regularly constructed defense systems out of mining gear, repulsor coils, and modified AI pets. Human adaptability wasn't linear. It was exponential under pressure. The Velkrax adapted through generations. They evolved their strengths through breeding, conditioning, and battlefield culling. Humanity somehow adapted in real time. It defied evolutionary logic. It felt wrong. The High Corps intensified surveillance. Probes were sent. Disguised diplomatic vessels landed on human colonies. Every result fed a singular conclusion. Humanity was not ready for war. And that was the problem, because they fought anyway. The Clawborn, Velkrax elite units forged through combat exposure so brutal it erased identity. petitioned for live testing. They wanted a sample. A frontier human colony was chosen, Terra 4, located in a nebulaic shroud. Minor mining outpost. Sparse population. Seemingly ideal for a test of strength. Authorization was granted. The Clawborn did not descend in secret. Their ships darkened the atmosphere with purpose. The intention was intimidation, a warning before annihilation. Velkrax doctrine called it psychological priming. Terra did not respond with panic. No mass evacuations. No surrender. Instead, a single transmission was received by the flagship, a live video feed of a human adolescent sitting calmly in front of a shattered drone. The child looked directly at the camera and said, "You picked the wrong species." That message was followed by coordinated sensor interference. Velkrax orbital units lost contact with ground teams before the first wave fully deployed. Anti-satellite pulses blanketed the upper atmosphere, knocking out surveillance drones with electromagnetic scramblers that shouldn't have existed on such a backwater world. The Velkrax considered it a fluke, a lucky strike, until the second wave landed. The terrain was mapped, analyzed, and neutralized beforehand, but what greeted them was not the scanned landscape. It had changed. Human engineers, using subterranean heating, atmospheric alteration, and kinetic detonators, had modified their environment in days. Forests had grown where there were none. Riverbeds rerouted. Structures disguised as terrain anomalies. Entire pathways had been lured with fake thermal signatures into minefields built out of industrial waste. This wasn't defense. It was theater. The Velkrax attempted standard advanced formations. 2 units were swallowed by terrain collapses timed to seismic microquakes. Others were led into kill zones by decoys emitting false Velkrax pheromonal markers. One Clawborn squad engaged in direct combat, only to find their weapons rendered inert by frequency jamming bursts projected from low-orbit balloons. Not one human was seen directly. What was seen were results. Shattered exosuits, melted armor, and psychological destabilization. Clawborn began experiencing fear responses. Impossible. But it happened. One even attempted self-termination to avoid further exposure. Recovered black box data. Revealed strange audio loops embedded in the environment. Not warnings. Not threats. But laughter. Echoing. Unnatural. Reversed. Digitally altered. Mixed with animal growls and human voices. They were designed to create mental dissonance. It worked. The Velkrax were not defeated in battle. They were dismantled in preparation. The High Corps, upon receiving this data, called for immediate escalation. They refused to believe a species barely in galactic adolescence could counter Clawborn doctrine. They believed they had encountered a rogue human strain. Anomalies happen, but anomalies could not define the whole. The Velkrax Council reconvened in urgency. What began as a targeted exercise in dominance had devolved into a spiraling confrontation they could no longer define by traditional parameters. They had faced resistance before, tribes, nations, species, but never transformation. Humanity's refusal to conform to the rhythm of war was not just unexpected. It was existentially disorienting. They were not static opponents to be measured and countered. They were a recursive equation, one that revised itself every iteration. The High Corps authorized Operation Core Glass, a campaign to isolate, infiltrate, and eliminate human operational nodes across 8 border systems. The assumption, humans were dependent on logistics. Cut their lines, shatter their coordination, and they would collapse. Precision strikes began. Relay stations vaporized. Trade corridors mined. Communications blacked out. For 72 hours, silence. On the 73rd, the retaliation began, not with fleets, but with sabotage. Velkrax ships discovered their own data cores corrupted. Navigation systems rerouted jump patterns. Emergency beacons led them into gravity wells. Human agents, embedded long before contact had been official, triggered cascading failures across key infrastructure. They had anticipated the strategy. They had planned for it. And they used the very logic of the Velkrax against them. Captured communications detailed a disturbing philosophy. Humans didn't fight to win a war. They fought to prevent their extinction, and they considered defeat not a conclusion, but a stage. what Velkrax perceived as total victory. Humans treated as terrain to retake. For every outpost burned, another rose hidden, armored by misdirection and defiance. Humanity had no central command in the traditional sense. It was decentralized, chaotic, and rapidly reactive. Decision-making wasn't filtered by hierarchy, but accelerated through swarm logic. Units adapted without orders. Civilians acted with strategic impact. Cultural myths turned into wartime doctrine. Velkrax interrogators discovered prisoners who cited ancient Earth tales, Thermopylae, guerrilla campaigns, asymmetric warfare, as if they were manuals. The Velkrax attempted infiltration. Genetic chameleons were embedded in human colonies. Everyone failed, not because they were discovered immediately, but because they could not function among humans. They couldn't process the sheer unpredictability, the random acts of hospitality, the embedded sarcasm, the code switching. One agent terminated its mission after 3 days, citing cultural cognitive fatigue. Another self-reported insanity after prolonged exposure to Earth humor channels. Psychological warfare had backfired. Human media, raw, emotional, contradictory, was a weapon. They laughed through suffering. They memorialized tragedy by mocking it. No consensus could be predicted. One colony turned a bombing into a parade. Another sculpted memorials from shrapnel and labeled them inspiration. Every act of violence seeded new resistance, artistic, technological, and strategic. The Velkrax then escalated. A full fleet, 2 dreadnoughts, 5 carriers, 34 escorts. The objective, raise a mid-tier human planet, Halios Prime. Not a backwater like Terra, 4, a legitimate trade hub. Visible, strategic, symbolic. They transmitted intent hours before arrival. Standard doctrine, fear induction. Humanity responded before the fleet entered orbit. Civilian vessels engaged in false evacuation drills, scattering across hundreds of trajectories. Planetary defenses went silent. Surface scans revealed no activity. The Velkrax assumed panic. They began orbital descent. That's when the ships began dying. One by one, vessels disappeared from telemetry. No weapons fired. No impact alerts. Just blackouts. Later analysis revealed signal hijacks. A viral code injected through quantum pingbacks during the fleet's own scans. Human code that rewrote subsystems, redirected life support, disabled weapons, and vented compartments. Not viruses, parasites. Self-replicating, environment-adaptive algorithms that evolved mid-attack. The dreadnoughts, proud symbols of Velkrax superiority, were turned into prisons of silence. Entire crews trapped, drifting above a world that refused to acknowledge their presence. When boarding shuttles finally landed, they found Halios Prime transformed. Not abandoned, repurposed. Streets layered with reactor panels. Buildings converted into signal jammers. Sewers armed. Air composition subtly shifted. Everything from advertisements to traffic signs had been weaponized. The humans weren't fighting the war. The planet was. And then the humans emerged. Not soldiers. Not even organized units. Families. Workers. Engineers. Teachers. Wearing armored exosuits assembled from agricultural gear. Plasma cutters modified into rifles. Riot shields that doubled as solar panels. Each unit bore a mark, not of rank but of origin. Neighborhoods, schools, sports teams. They didn't fight for command. They fought for each other. The Velkrax had no counter to that. Their tactics assumed individual expendability. Humanity's strength was collective defiance fused with personal investment. Every death mattered. Every loss encoded into strategy. A fallen comrade was not forgotten, but integrated into the next plan. Names became call signs. Memories became algorithms. Velkrax assault units disintegrated. Those that survived fled. The fleet, crippled and confused, retreated. Human ships did not pursue. They didn't need to. They had made their point. The Velkrax were shaken. Analysis centers compiled terabytes of data. No pattern of human resistance repeated. Every engagement was unique. Every countermeasure evolved. Projections showed a catastrophic trend. Velkrax battle effectiveness reduced by 30% per engagement. Morale declined. Recruitment slowed. Young warriors began questioning the doctrine. The council demanded clarity. They received a single message, not encrypted, not disguised, just a simple transmission from a hacked comm relay. It contained a human child's voice reading a poem, ancient, earthborn, about rising each time one falls. It was not a threat. It was a declaration of identity. The High Corps panicked. They began classifying humanity not as a combatant species, but as an existential disruptor, one that broke the foundational assumptions of conflict. Velkrax's strategy had always relied on predictability, linear escalation, dominance through repetition. But humanity didn't escalate linearly. They exploded outward, sideways, inward. Every loss splintered into new innovations. Every defeat became architecture for vengeance. The Velkrax initiated diplomatic outreach, a rarity. They offered neutral zones, trade, observation pacts. Humanity refused, politely, respectfully, but clearly not out of arrogance, but because they no longer feared the apex. Fear had shifted. The Velkrax feared what they didn't understand. A species that should have broken, that should have surrendered, that should have begged. Instead, it had analyzed the predators, dismantled their assumptions, and rebuilt the battlefield in its image. And worst of all, humanity hadn't even mobilized its full strength. No unified fleet had launched. No central war declaration made. Most human systems were still uninvolved, watching, learning, refining. The war wasn't humanity versus Velkrax.